Our first two panelists will be covering geopolitical dangers and emerging risks. First up is Dr. Zia Mian. Zia Mian is a physicist and co-director of Princeton University's program on science and global security, part of the School of Public and International Affairs. He also directs the program's Project on Peace and Security in South Asia. He received the 2014 Linus Pauling Legacy Award for his accomplishments as a scientist and as a peace activist in contributing to the global effort for nuclear disarmament and for a more peaceful world. In 2018, he was selected as one of the 60 Faces of CND by the UK Campaign for Nuclear Disarmament to mark its 60th anniversary. He also received the American Physical Society's 2019 Leo Szilard Award for promoting global peace and nuclear disarmament. He also serves on the board of the Arms Control Association. Zia, welcome to the panel.
Thank you, Danny. My task today is to talk about the current dangers of nuclear war that we face today and looking forward. So my brief remarks are going to focus on what is the danger of nuclear war today, and how do we understand it, and what are some of the processes, the geopolitical processes that are creating this danger of nuclear war. The first point I want to make is that we do not know how great is the danger of nuclear war today in absolute terms, and we cannot even imagine this danger, because it is actually impossible to know all the different paths that could lead to war and all the ways in which a war today could turn into a nuclear war. The history of the last more than 100 years, certainly throughout the 20th century, has taught us that no one can know how the smallest events can spiral in unforeseen, unexpected ways through actually existing political structures and decision-making by leaders into wars that have absolutely catastrophic consequences. What we do know is that out of the 193 countries in the world today, there are only 9 countries that could start a nuclear war, since only those 9 countries actually have control of nuclear weapons. And everybody should know these 9 countries. I mean, this is one of the great central political facts of our time, and that is that it's the United States, Russia, Britain, France, China, Israel, India, Pakistan, and North Korea. This is where the nuclear danger lives. It is the nuclear war machines that are managed, funded, and operated by political and military institutions of these countries that are the source of the danger that imperils humankind with nuclear war. We also know for certain that while we do not know the paths that can lead us to nuclear war, we do know that it is only in a world without nuclear weapons that we can be sure that no war can turn into a nuclear war. So how great is the danger today? Even if we don't know it in absolute terms, do we have a sense of how it is compared to what it's been like in the past? One way to ask this question is looking back in the historical record and looking back at the judgments of people who've lived through the history of the nuclear age. And one person who has tried to help us understand this is former US Secretary of Defense, William Perry. And he recently issued his own judgment looking back on a life spent working on nuclear weapons at the highest levels of decision-making in the United States. And his judgment is, and I quote, "Today, the danger of some sort of a nuclear catastrophe is greater than it was during the Cold War." And Bill Perry's judgment, this danger is greater than it was during the Cold War, includes the time of the Cuban Missile Crisis of 1962. And Perry knows this because he was there. He was actually working in the CIA, looking at photos of the Soviet missiles in Cuba that were then being sent to the White House for President Kennedy to decide what to do. And Perry has said that, "I thought every day when I went back to my hotel, it was the last day of my life. It was the end of civilization, and I thought it was about to happen." So that's one judgment of where we are today. Now, a second judgment is offered by Daniel Ellsberg, who was also there during the Cuban Missile Crisis. but working in the White House. And in his book, The Doomsday Machine, Daniel Ellsberg has explained that the US nuclear war plan that was in place at the time of the Cuban Missile Crisis was expected by the US military and understood by President Kennedy in the White House that the war plan would lead to the immediate deaths of over 600 million people within 6 months if nuclear war was carried out according to the US war plan. This didn't include the deaths of people in the United States. This is how many the US military anticipated killing if they started nuclear war. Now, Ellsberg also was there and understood that the risk of nuclear war was not understood by President Kennedy and the people around him. They only knew that it was high. Kennedy himself is said to have believed that there was a 30% to 50% chance of nuclear war. And as I mentioned, Perry believes that the risk today is greater. We also know the risks of what was in play that led people to run this kind of risk of nuclear war. We know from the historical record that in the discussions in the White House during the Cuban Missile Crisis, the question was actually asked, what is the strategic impact on the position of the United States of the new Soviet missiles in Cuba? In other words, what difference does it make to us now that the Soviet missiles in Cuba? How significantly does this change the strategic balance between the United States and the Soviet Union? Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara told the president, this changes nothing at all for us. This is not a military problem we are facing. It is a political problem. So my first point was that we don't know the risk of war, and people, even at the highest levels, disagree and don't understand the actual risk. And the second is that the source of the problem and the willingness to run this risk is not because of some objective military threat. It is because of judgments about politics. So what is the political problem today where the US and others who are in charge of nuclear weapons are willing to run the risk of nuclear war? The issue we face is that the United States, since the end of the Cold War, has wanted to ensure its overwhelming power in international politics. Not just in some abstract means, but an absolute overwhelming power in comparison to all others. And this is simply not a future that other countries are willing to share. And this has been codified, in the early days after the Cold War, by the Defense Department, where it was determined that the first objective of US policy is to prevent the re-emergence of a new rival. And our goal should be to prevent any hostile power from dominating any region where it could be possible for it to become a significant threat to the United States. In other words, we won't even allow the emergence of regional powers in this post-Cold War world. And what we've seen instead of this absolute US domination is that in the case of Russia, following the collapse of the Soviet Union, there has been a determined effort by Vladimir Putin and others to make Russia great again. They are not willing to accept second-class status, at least in their region. And so we've seen an increasing level of tension as the US and NATO have expanded to Russia's borders, and Russia has tried to push back in ways to assert its power, including through the use of force and violence and threats. But ultimately, the issue is about who gets to decide what happens in the Russian neighborhood and the role of Russia in the international system, and the US trying to control the structure of global politics. The second region, which is of great concern, is of course East Asia, where the rise of China over the past 30 years is seen as a challenge to the United States. China is basically surrounded by US allies and military bases and military forces in the South China Sea and in Japan and various other US allies in the region. And as China rises and seeks to assert its dominance in its neighborhood, the US is seeking to push China back from having regional power and the possibility of global power in the future. So this tension between the US effort to ensure its absolute and its relative dominant position is clashing with the efforts by Russia to reassert its historical rights and power in the region, and of China to assert its newfound role because of its rising economy and political power in its region. Ultimately, the issue that leads this and connects this to nuclear weapons, of course, is that the fragile architecture of nuclear restraint that was put in place during the Cold War, when people understood that war could become nuclear war and would have catastrophic consequences, is that the US has been withdrawing from nuclear arms control treaties and is committed to modernizing its entire nuclear arsenal, as have other nuclear armed states. And so what we face is a future of continuing geopolitical competition with a new generation of nuclear weapons, ballistic missiles, and submarines that will be at play. My last point is actually about the new nuclear nations that have emerged since the Cold War, especially in South Asia, where India and Pakistan have a history of nuclear wars, and now both have nuclear weapons. And what we see is that any tension between them has the risk of spiraling into nuclear war, especially since Pakistan threatens the first use of nuclear weapons in a conflict. And the most recent understanding of the effects of nuclear war by climate change scientists has led us to understand that even a limited nuclear war between India and Pakistan, never mind a war between the US and Russia or between the US and China, a limited war between India and Pakistan, where they only use a few tens of weapons against each other's cities, would have disastrous global consequences for human beings and for agriculture and for nature. The possibility of a nuclear winter starting from even a low-level nuclear war has become an increasing concern and adds a whole new level of risk to our understanding of what is the nuclear threat we face today. So with that, I will end my remarks.